Hola, welcome back to episode 9 of the Chicana Therapist podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Xochilt Alamillo, and today I actually want to talk about entrepreneurship. And that might come as a surprise because this is a mental health geared podcast. But before you think that this doesn't apply to you, I want to talk about everything that leads us to want to be entrepreneurs. And I want to talk about the things we have to work on to become entrepreneurs and why the things we have to think about actually apply to everyone, because there's a lot of fear around being a business owner. There's a lot of fear about doing things that maybe no one you know has done before. And there's definitely a lot of fear, and I include myself in this, around being more visible. So right now, marketing is mostly on social media, right? And so I think that I work with people who have dreams that they put on hold because they think, ¿Qué dirá la gente? So that's what we're going to talk about today, about this idea of holding back from your dreams, holding back from who you really want to be, because you're afraid of failing. You're afraid of what people will say. You're afraid of people laughing at you. And that's real. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm really passionate about talking about entrepreneurship because I think I've just always been one of these people who wants to do her own thing for a lot of reasons. You might blame it on my ADHD. You might blame it on being an Aries. You might blame it on anything. But I've always been that type of person. I remember being a little girl and thinking of ways to make money because everything I wanted, my parents would say, well, we don't have money for that. And so I would always think like, okay, well, then how can I make money to do the thing, right? So I remember thinking about having a lemonade stand. I would think about, selling things, making things. It was always something that I thought about. And when I became an adult, I kind of fell into entrepreneurship without even realizing it, because my first big girl job was real estate, which, if you don't know, is fully commission. So I had to sell in order to make money, and I set my own hours. I did everything on my own. I was my own boss, basically. There is no salary. There's no safety net. And so technically, I've been an entrepreneur since basically day one of my adult life. Since then, I've started more businesses than I can count on one hand. I had a retail store at one point. For many years, I had an eBay reselling business. I joined MLMs. Yes, I said it. We don't need to dwell on it. And eventually in 2020, right before the world completely shut down, I opened my own private practice, Vida Counseling, which was always kind of the dream ever since I knew I was going to be a therapist. I knew that I wanted to have my own private practice. And so that's kind of what my life has been like all the time. I'm sure there's more businesses that I tried or started or meant to start, or that I lost interest in, whatever the case may be. But it's not, I don't want to say it because I want to point out my randomness. That's not what it is. What I want you to hear is that I was someone who could not stop trying to build something. Even when it didn't work, even when it was messy and I looked like a failure, or I thought people saw me as a failure, I always had that entrepreneurial spirit, and I just kept finding new ways to do it. After trying all kinds of different things, it kind of sucked to have inconsistent income. I'm not going to lie, especially when you have kids and they're depending on things. You have a family and it's like, are you going to have a good month or a bad month? That kind of thing. I was ready to kind of get a 9-to-5 a few times. In fact, I did get a 9-to-5. I have been in 9-to-5s throughout my life. But then when I got into one that I was happy with, in other words, I loved my job, I loved what I was doing, even then, I found that the expectations were impossibly high and there was limited support. Oftentimes, there was management that made you feel small, or they made you feel like, you work for them, and so they can squeeze every ounce of energy out. And not to say that all my management was like that. I had some great managers, but also they had limited power. There were still expectations. The flexibility was not there the way that I would have wanted flexibility. There was no grace for mistakes. There was just make us money, right? And that really made my 9 to 5 journey short-lived. And since I'm being vulnerable, I'll also say that it was deeply personal to me because I live with chronic conditions and that are invisible or that a lot of people wouldn't understand. For example, ADHD is very misunderstood by workplaces. And so there's nothing quite like being in a 9 to 5 that has zero understanding for that, especially when as a Latina, where I feel like I'm a first gen and I have to do everything perfect. Calling in sick just didn't seem like it was a option. And even when you did, even then it might seem like an inconvenience to the org that you're working for. So I knew early on after I got my job after my master's degree that I couldn't keep doing that. That just wasn't going to be for me. And I needed to build something that could hold all of me with my chronic conditions, with my ADHD, with my different needs, wants, and desires. And that did give me consistent income because that was my complaint about the other times. So when people ask me why I work for myself, I want to be clear. It wasn't because I thought I was too good for working for other people. It's because I had enough experience in the systems to know that they just were not built for someone like me. And instead of spending my energy trying to make someone else happy and make someone else money, I decided that I would do it for myself. So then I finished my PhD and I, along the way, realized academia wasn't going to be my path either. Academia has a lot of more flexibility, but it has its own cons. So I thought, okay, I have this degree, I have this knowledge, I have my community that I'm deeply committed to and that I really want to serve as a resource for. And I'm adaptable, so let's build something that actually fits. But then, and this is where I, again, think that a lot of you might relate, the fear kicks in because it's one thing to dream big. It's one thing to have plans, but then to actually do it, to be visible, to be public, to have your name and your face and seemingly everybody watching, that's when you start to get doubts. That's when you start saying, ¿Qué dirá la gente? You know, I consider myself a strong woman and I consider myself pretty self-confident. But even then, I had to push to get myself to get to a point where I was comfortable being visible, being seen. And I can tell you that I'm still not 100% there. I still get a little shy when people tell me, oh, I saw your post. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what did you see? It's something I don't know. I can't say that I'll always struggle with it, but it's definitely something I'm still working on. So I wanted to focus on that for a while. ¿Qué dirá la gente? Right? What will people say? Because if you grew up in a Latinx household, you don't even need me to explain the phrase. You probably even felt it as I said it. It's that look that somebody gives you, at the table, or it's the reason you didn't tell anyone about your dreams or your business ideas or the hobbies that you did until you were comfortable with it, until it was already working or until you kind of measured to see if they were okay with it. It's like a way of knowing that we're such a tight community that when you step in the spotlight, you're stepping into the spotlight, not just for yourself, but for everybody. And that can be a lot of pressure. In my case, the people watching would include my family, my husband's family, my community, other academics who already had opinions about what you're supposed to do when you get a PhD. And spoiler alert, it was not to keep doing private practice and start a podcast. There are people who are elitist in academia, and when you walk away from the path that you're supposed to walk according to them, they notice. And not everyone. I have people that are super happy for me and are very supportive, but there are people, people have thoughts. People wonder if maybe you couldn't cut it or she didn't make it in academia and so you wasted your degree. I think that was one of my biggest fears, is that people thought, and some people have honestly told me in a passive aggressive way that I wasted my degree, or, in some other way, like wanted me to feel like I wasn't doing enough or I was doing too much. And having all that, knowing that there were people who judged me and who had opinions about me, and on top of that, knowing that I'm risking things, because I'm not going to say entrepreneurship is all rainbows and butterflies. I was risking not having consistent income. I was risking being judged by not just those people that I knew felt some kind of way, but people who I'd spent years trying to earn their respect. And I risked having to go back, having to say, oh, well, this didn't work, and then get a 9 to 5 because it didn't work. And that just felt huge. It felt enormous, because when you're doing something like I want to do or I am doing, failure wasn't going to be just personal. It was going to be public. And that was something that I didn't know if I was ready to risk. But as a therapist, I told myself that same thing that I would tell my clients, and that is that the risk is there with everything. I could get a 9 to 5 and get laid off. Matter of fact, I did. Right before I got into my PhD program, I was laid off. It so happened that I was going into grad school, so it didn't matter. But, every job could end. Every relationship could end, for that matter. Everything you do, there's no guarantee. The only thing that was maybe different about me is that everyone could see, whereas I could maybe keep it to myself if I lost my job or something else, right? Assuming I would be wanting to keep it private. But it just felt so public. There was something else underneath it, I think, and it's really hard to put into words, but I'm going to try. When you're a first-generation Latina, when you're the one in your family who got the PhD, when your dreams don't look like anyone else around you, there's this fear that's not just about you, I think. It's about what it means if you fail, who you're letting down, what it says about whether someone like you was ever supposed to try this in the first place. And I think a lot of first-gen Latinas we step up, we have this opportunity, we get to places that were not made for us, and the fear being perceived as a failure, that's just not acceptable, right? After you're like this overachiever. And so I had to make a decision. And the decision wasn't to stop being afraid, because I don't think that fear ever fully goes away. Till this day, I put out an episode every week and I'm like, oh my God, what if 0 people listen to it? But what I decided was that I was going to be afraid and I was going to do it anyway. It was just going to be the price of building something that I wanted. And at the end of the day, even if I tried and failed, I told myself that it was okay to be seen trying. It's okay to be seen trying. And even if I did fail, maybe the next person will learn from my experience and do better and better until someone succeeded. And it's a continuous recommitment to your dream, because I started my private practice in 2020. And yes, the pandemic hit. But even then, I was able to adapt and I was able to start my business virtually. And that is when a lot of loss started to happen in my life. That is when so many things were changing. And it was hard for me emotionally to keep up with a private practice, because again, I was experiencing a lot of loss of loved ones. And there were constant moments of me wanting to quit, and my fantasy. And I think a lot of us who are entrepreneurs or who are leaders in organizations even have a fantasy. And I've talked to a few of my friends about this. And for me, the fantasy is to quit everything and just get a job at Costco and just live my life happy at Costco because I love Costco. I have quite a few friends who have the fantasy sometimes of quitting and being baristas. I've heard of quite a few, but I think the barista one is very popular. Just getting a just show up job, which nothing's wrong with that. We dream of that because it might have its own stress, but it's not the added stress that I mentioned earlier about being an entrepreneur. Anyway, I think we all have our pandemic story, whether it's you lived your best life in lockdown or you were miserable because you're an extrovert. For me, my family experienced a lot of loss during that time. It was loss after loss after loss. And so I was carrying a lot of grief, real deep personal grief. And I was also sitting with clients who were carrying their own grief. Everyone was struggling. And I'm a therapist, so people are coming to me. Business was booming, okay? And I'm showing up because that's what we do. That's what we're trained to do. That's what we want to do. But I can tell you that I was not well. And that is when I fantasized about going to a job, not just a 9 to 5, but just a job where I could go and clock in and just do what someone else tells me to do and do exactly that, when to do it, how to do it, and then go home. No decisions, no holding other people's pain, no nothing, none of that. No wondering if your business is going to make it or cleaning up your tears before the next session. You just show up, you do the task, and you go home. And I can tell you that that is my hardest moment of when I thought of quitting. But it's been 6 years since the pandemic started, and there are many moments like that. Like I said, I was grieving. I lost many loved ones, but one in particular was my cousin who I saw as a brother, died of cancer. And my grief was heavy, and I didn't know what to do with it, especially not being on lockdown, right? And I had to be a mom to kids who also didn't know what to do during lockdown, right? And it was just a lot. And I'm not embarrassed to say that because we don't usually, or at least those of us who are visible public entrepreneurs where people kind of follow our story and what we're doing, I don't know that we talk enough about that piece of the times that we just want to quit. We're tired, we're exhausted, and we can't call in. You can't call in to your own business. So I struggled through that, but with a lot of support, I made it through. And I found the importance of community, of other entrepreneurs, of other community leaders, of other women in particular who were building things and struggling and still showing up. In particular, I joined a leadership fellowship that gave me a place to be inspired and supported, and that had people that saw all the different sides of me, the academia side and the entrepreneur side and the leadership side and the mom side. And one of the things about that fellowship is that they invested in business coaching for me. And it changed a lot for me. And not necessarily because it gave me some sort of formula to doing business correctly, but because for the first time, I had someone helping me see the business that I wanted to build clearly. This time with the addition of I wanted more flexibility around being able to walk away when I was needing additional support. And that wasn't having a private practice only business. I had someone who was helping me think strategically, who was helping me believe that what I was doing was worth doing and that I had what it took to do it and that people wanted to see what I wanted to put out. After that, I kept investing in coaching, and it was pivotal, honestly, in my growth, in my knowledge, in what I've been able to build. And since then, I recommitted, maybe not with fireworks. And I don't know, I always say I do things sometimes por terca, just I'm stubborn, I guess, the way that a lot of us are. I kept going, and so I started offering things little by little. I started offering trainings and workshops and speaking engagements, I started doing retreats, local ones, and we're now doing international ones. I started the blog. I got much more visible on social media, and eventually this podcast, especially because right when I started this podcast is when it became, not it became, but I think one of the platforms, I think it was maybe Apple, that made podcasts also like a visible thing, like kind of like YouTube where you can hear it, but you could also view it. And so I don't know what it's like to do a podcast without the video portion of it. So I've gotten more comfortable with it, sure. And I'm excited about what's yet to come. All of what I'm doing so far points toward the same thing that I've always been pointing towards, and that's building something that serves my community and that is fully unapologetically mine. And through all of it, the grief, the almost quitting, the building, there was something that I kept coming back to, and it wasn't really about the business. It was about thinking about who I was carrying it for. And I've carried them my whole life, I think. And that's the weight of what it means to build something publicly when you're a first generation Latina. And something that I tell people is that everything I do, when I post, when I record, when I stand in front of a room, and when I teach, anytime I put my name on something, I'm not just doing it for me. And I know that that sounds so cliche, but I promise you this is the truth. I am doing it for every first-gen Latina who was told that her dreams were too big or too different or too much. For every woman in this community who has a PhD or a master's or even a bachelor's and doesn't know what to do with it outside the boxes that were built for someone else. And for every mother who has big dreams that don't look like anyone else's and is wondering if that's okay. I do it for those women. I'm doing it for all of them. And sometimes I get asked when I say that if that feels like too much pressure. And my answer is that I don't think of it as pressure. It's just who I am. It's who I've always been. I've always been that person, even when I wasn't aware of it. So when we talk about representation, this is what we talk about. It's about being in rooms and taking up spaces and doing things that gets other people to say, hey, maybe I can do that. And I think I'm finally in a place in my business where I feel like I'm finally letting all the big dreams out. I'm not holding back. Am I making a fool of myself? Sure, maybe. And I'm okay with that because, again, I don't want to be afraid of being seen trying. I don't want to be afraid of other people's judgment, particularly when it's people who I have no interest in what they think of me. Because the people who I care what they think about me, they're my biggest supporters. So if you are sitting with that fear, que dirá la gente, if you're wondering whether you're allowed to want what you want, whether you're equipped enough, whether you're ready, I want to talk to you. Even if you feel the fear, it's not a sign that you shouldn't do it. The fear, I think, is a sign that it matters. And I would say do it even when you're scared. And I recently told someone this. I said, maybe even do it with a plan on failing, because that might take some of the pressure off. And I don't know, to me, you don't really fail, you just adapt. So all of that is why I want to build what I'm building, what I'm still building. And I am very passionate about other Latinas doing what they dream about doing, even when they're afraid, instead of like just feeling like they have to work for the man. And so I will be talking more about this. I will be talking more about that fear of following your dreams. And it doesn't have to be entrepreneurship. It could be, I don't know, a hobby that you've wanted to take up, but you don't know anybody. Or maybe it's traveling when nobody around you is a traveler. Or maybe you are a Latina who thinks you don't have what it takes to go to college, to grad school, to a doctoral program, then this is also for you, because I was there at some point too. So if any of this resonates with you, especially if you're a clinician and you've been dreaming about doing something beyond private practice, beyond individual therapy, I want you to know that that's the work that I do through my coaching program, Creating Your Own Way. I'll put the link in the show notes. But for now, gracias for being here. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for supporting me. Cuídense mucho. Thank you for listening. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing shared in this podcast constitutes therapy, clinical advice, or a therapeutic relationship. Listening to this podcast does not establish a provider-client relationship, and if you're experiencing a mental health crisis or in need of clinical support, please contact a licensed mental health professional or call or text 988 Crisis Hotline.